your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Hello, I'm Naveen Day. Thanks for joining us for a look back at what made headlines in Alberta this week. Exhibition Park broke an attendance record for this year's Whoop Up Days. Over the 5-day fair last week, 77,263 visitors walked through the gates to take in the festivities. Officials say the attendance is more than 160% higher than the 6-year average. Mike Workington, CEO of Lethbridge and District Exhibition, believes a big contributor to the record breaker was the free admission they offered to get into the park.
What we had always said when we made that call was that we wanted it to be accessible for everyone, and we certainly saw the success of doing so. And then the other two factors that played in, I think there was a lot of curiosity about the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Centre, and literally thousands of people got the opportunity to see and experience this venue that we're standing in today. And lastly, we couldn't have had better weather for all 5 days. Yes, it quite literally rained on our parade a little bit, but shortly after that, the clouds cleared and we had 5 perfect days of weather for the fair.
6 Lethbridge paddlers did their country proud earlier this month, earning lots of medals in the IDBF World Dragon Boat Racing Championship in Thailand. Video journalist Micah Quinn met up with a few of the winners at Henderson Lake on Tuesday morning to chat about their recent success.
Canada's national team brought home 52 gold, 36 silver, and 13 bronze medals at the event. China and the United States rounded off the top 3 spots with 30 and 24 gold medals, respectively. Mia Chalmette competed in the U18 category and won 2 gold and 2 silver medals with her team.
The first gold that we got was in the women's U18 1,000 meters. And then after that one was the 2,000 meters, which we received silver behind the U.S. And then the third race was the 200 meters, which we again received silver behind the U.S. And then the last race, the races that I'm personally most proud of because I love 500 meters. They're my favorite race. We did get gold for that one.
Linda Gilbert also brought home several medals under the senior C level. Gilbert says the training in Lethbridge to prepare for the championships was top-notch and allowed the team to compete at a high level during this year's games.
I also have a team coach out in Pickering, Ontario that I've been working with, and that's been helpful as well. So without their guidance, I definitely would have not been able to get where I was at and where I wanted to be.
Canada has brought home a total of 467 standard boat medals over the course of 14 IDBF World Championships, which is more than double the next closest nation. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
The folks at Canadian Blood Services are urging folks to help donate blood and plasma to help with blood supply issues. The agency says summertime is already a difficult time for them to maintain their supply, and the summer has been even harder due to the wildfires in BC.
In Kelowna alone, we've had to cancel about 300 plasma appointments as people deal with evacuations and the stress of the wildfires. So we're really trying to make up those numbers, as well as even with the wildfires in Alberta, although we didn't have to cancel appointments, when those things happen, we do see less donors coming in. So this summer particularly has been really difficult.
The Lethbridge Soup Kitchen says they need more volunteers to help serve meals to some of the city's most vulnerable. Bill Ginther, the executive director of the Soup Kitchen, says they have been seeing an increase in people using their services and they don't have enough volunteers to help meet the demand.
We keep increasing, or we see an increase in the number of people that are coming to eat. It does slow down a little bit in summer, but what also happens in summer is, like you and me, people like to be away on vacation. And that happens. So what happens quite frequently is we'll have teams that are signed up regularly, maybe once a month or even once a week. If it seems that if 1 or 2 of them are away, the rest feel that they can't come either. So we'll have people cancel out within a few hours or a day before, saying our team of 10 won't be able to come this month.
Researchers at the University of Lethbridge have been awarded more than $2.3 million in funding supports. The cash infusion was announced by federal government ministers Francois Philippe Champagne and Mark Holland in Edmonton. The money is part of a $960 million investment by Ottawa in research activities across the country. U of L Vice President Dina McMartin says the funding will help support faculty members to hire more personnel, help to train graduate and undergraduate students, and to purchase essential equipment. And on the subject of funding, how does an extra $2.4 billion sound? We'll tell you about where all that cash came from and where it's headed after this short break. Albertans received a fiscal update from the province on Thursday. Treasury Board President and Finance Minister Nate Horner offered up details of Alberta's first quarter and how well our economy is doing. The fiscal update shows a surplus of $2.4 billion, with the provincial debt to be projected at $76.7 billion, which is down $2.6 billion from 2022. Minister Horner says the price of oil has been helping with the province's bottom line, but so has a lot of tax revenue that has been generated.
Our revenue forecast for 23-24 has increased to $71.1 billion, a $491 million jump that's being driven by significant increases in both personal and corporate income tax revenue. Our strong population growth and low-cost, low-tax, business-friendly environment are driving a projected $1.5 billion income tax revenue increase. Of our total revenue, corporate income tax for the year is now forecast at $6.8 billion, an $889 million increase from budget. It's worth pointing out that we're achieving that number with the lowest corporate income tax rate in the country by a wide margin.
And the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is applauding the Alberta government's fiscal update. The Alberta director with the CTF, Chris Sims, says it is great that the recent surplus is being put to good use.
So they now have a law in the province of Alberta where the surplus cash, 50% of it, half, has to go down onto the debt, and the rest of it either has to go into Heritage Savings Trust Fund or towards spending that doesn't increase overall spending. All of that is to say is they've got really good fiscal rules in place right now, and they're sticking to them, and we're really happy to see that.
Now, the interest on the debt could continue to be an issue for Alberta, however, with the province estimated to spend around $3 billion on interest charges this fiscal year, despite a lessening debt load. And according to Sims, there's more good news for Albertans. Parents who are shopping for school supplies are saving quite a bit of money. The biggest reason is because we only have a GST and not a provincial sales tax here. Alberta is home to around 700,000 students enrolled in kindergarten to grade 12 who are returning to school shortly. She shares with us how much money we're saving due to the Alberta Advantage.
We're actually saving quite a bit of money. I sat up there nestled next to my calculator last night and did the math. And on average, if you've got 2 kids in your family, you're going to save around $50 in your back to school supply shopping trips because we don't have a PST. When you add all of that up across the province, it's around $17 or $18 million in total.
And the Correctional Service of Canada says police are investigating after officers at a maximum security federal institution in Alberta seized contraband worth close to $400,000. They say it happened at Edmonton Institution on August the 19th when a package containing contraband and unauthorized items was seized. The seized items include illicit substances along with 4 cell phones and 7 SIM cards. A number of business owners in our province are not happy with their recent electricity bills. Some business owners say their utility bills have gone through the roof from $5,000 to $9,000 a month. Nathan Newdorf is our province's Affordability and Utilities Minister. He says help is on the way.
This is exactly why we're doing all the work that we're doing on this file to try to bring those bills down. The number one challenge for Alberta right now is the volatility in our grid. The last couple of days, we've had ISO alerts where the grid is at risk of not having the capacity needed, predominantly because wind and solar haven't been producing to the efficiency and levels that they were expected to. And that volatility drives the prices, as well as highlights the need for more baseload supply, which we're actively working on.
The Alberta government says they will continue to monitor a mild strain of COVID-19 that is going around. In a statement to Bridge City News, the province says the EG 5.1 variant is a descendant of the Omicron variant. There is currently no evidence to suggest EG 5.1 can cause more severe illness than previous versions of the virus. Around 200 Albertans who were previously found guilty of breaking pandemic-related public health orders could see their fines quashed and their money returned to them. Just under a month ago, Justice Barbara Romaine ruled the province's health orders were invalid because they breached the Public Health Act. She said the Chief Medical Officer of Health and not politicians should have made the final decision on health restrictions. And a number of Albertans have already had their charges dropped. These include Edmonton area Grace Life Church and its pastor James Coates, as well as Ty Northcott, who hosted a rodeo in protest of pandemic restrictions. Coming up after the break, many Albertans were shocked after hearing the news of a woman who was denied an organ transplant has died. According to the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, when the matter was taken to court regarding the denial, it was decided that her charter rights did not apply in this matter.
And I want to live to see my kids and my grandbabies.
Many Albertans have been reacting to the news that Sheila Annette Lewis died. She was the Alberta woman who was denied an organ transplant because she refused to get the COVID-19 vaccine. I had the opportunity to interview Annette late last year. Here's a clip from that interview.
And I will die. And it's not very long from now. And it's really scary. And I want to live to see my kids and my grandbabies. I just want to live.
According to the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, Lewis had been crowdsourcing funding to travel to the U.S. to get an organ transplant, but sadly, she didn't make it. Lewis also lost her fight to have the courts order the medical system to give her a transplant. To talk about this more in detail, Hal Roberts spoke with the president of the Justice Centre, John Carpe.
John, this is a tragedy on so many levels. Why couldn't the Court of King's Bench have helped Sheila Annette Lewis?
Biggest problem, of course, the court rulings were a problem because they did not delve into the evidence that was presented about the vaccine, and they decided that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't really apply to this. The biggest problem is the doctors who knew full well by December of 2021, everybody knew that the COVID vaccine did not prevent people from getting sick. It did not prevent the virus from spreading. It did not provide us with herd immunity, did not prevent people from dying with COVID. That was well known by December of 2021, if not a lot earlier. And it was in 2021 when the doctors started to pressure Sheila Annette Lewis into getting this vaccine. The culpability of the doctors became even worse in March of 2023 when Sheila Annette Lewis presented them with a blood test, which she had obtained at her own expense, showing that she had COVID antibodies. And so she had natural immunity. She had had COVID twice, once in 2021 and the second time more recently. So she survived COVID just fine twice without the vaccine.
So, John, what is the main takeaway from all of this? Is it that you must be vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus or else you're not eligible for an organ transplant here in Alberta?
Well, Albertans need to pick up their phones and phone their MLA and say that it's inexcusable that the government would allow Alberta Health Services to engage in this kind of utterly unscientific and unethical discrimination that has no foundation in medicine. And it is possible for Premier Smith and the Health Minister to simply inform Alberta Health Services that they are never again to do to other people what they did to Sheila Annette Lewis.
Thanks so much for your time today, John. That was John Carpe, president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, joining us from Calgary.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is now challenging Justin Trudeau's Environment Minister to take on China the way he takes on provinces. BCN's Hal Roberts sat down with political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilly to discuss this in more detail.
Brian, what is Premier Smith saying to Minister Stephen Guilbeault?
He's saying to him, look, you're sitting on the advisory board of the environmental group that tells the Communist Party of China what to do. They're building 2 coal-fired plants a week, and you're coming at Alberta, which is phasing out coal, but we'll still have some fossil fuels generating the electricity system. She's asking Guilbeault to be as tough on China as she is on Canadian provinces. Because if you recall, it's not just Alberta that Guilbeault's picking fights with. It's Alberta, it's Saskatchewan, it's Nova Scotia, it's Ontario. It's pretty much everywhere on this electricity grid or on other environmental issues. Meanwhile, he sits as the executive vice chairman of a group that was set up by the Communist Party of China, that is controlled by the Communist Party of China, but that brings in people from the outside to give them an appearance of legitimacy. And that's what he's doing here. Now, some people have pointed out, oh, yes, but Peter Kent sat on that years ago when he was Stephen Harper's environment minister. Sure, perhaps. But guess what? We didn't have China kidnapping our citizens back then, engaging in economic warfare over crops like canola or pork. We didn't have them interfering in our elections or setting up secret police stations to intimidate Chinese Canadians. So things have changed dramatically. And for Guilbeault to lecture the rest of the country on reducing climate emissions as he flies to China to advise a government that builds 2 coal plants a week, Smith is onto something. She's absolutely right to call Guilbeault out, but don't expect him to raise his voice in China.
We have more on the fight over Alberta's energy sector after this short break. Don't go away. The fight over Alberta's energy sector continues between Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Federal Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault. She says he has once again shown his utter contempt for Alberta, our economy, and our energy workers. However, the province and the Trudeau government could be getting close to a deal. Hal Roberts sat down with our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, for more details.
Now, Tyler, despite the recent rhetoric, the province and Trudeau government appear to be nearing a deal on a working group to further discuss energy issues.
So this goes back to the Calgary Stampede, actually, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was here to meet with Danielle Smith. And one of the things that they sort of agreed upon at that point was that they were going to set up a collaborative group to discuss, the various energy issues that are facing the province and the country, whether that's the Just Transition Plan that's been renamed the Sustainable Jobs Act, I think, the net zero electricity grid, the reduction on emissions from the oil sands by 2030. So, there's all these sort of issues percolating. And as you mentioned, there's been a lot of pretty fiery rhetoric over the past few years between Alberta and the federal government. The past 40 years, I guess, would probably be more accurate. But they do seem to be playing nice a little bit, at least behind closed doors. So the deal isn't fully signed yet for this working group, but it is going to be, if it all goes according to plan, a collection of senior officials from both the Alberta government and the Liberal government in Ottawa. And they'll be discussing, jurisdictional issues, who has, power over oil sands emissions, for example, what the net zero electricity grid might look like, sort of all of these issues. It seems like it's going to be a bit of a place to sit down and maybe talk about some of these things a little bit more collaboratively. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Liberals are going to bend on anything. That doesn't necessarily mean the UCP is going to bend. But, it does mean, I guess, that they're at least talking as opposed to yelling at each other over the newspapers.
And could we even see the Alberta Sovereignty Act brought forth with some of this?
We could. I mean, I think the question is probably what in what context and how is it going to work? Let's say the Alberta government passes a motion under the Alberta Sovereignty Act on net zero electricity grid. Well, what is that going to look like? What are the implications of that? We haven't heard a whole lot about it lately, other than I believe Premier Smith or Rebecca Schultz had said, we'll use every item in our toolkit here. I suspect we'll see, legal battles and things like that first. It strikes me as the Sovereignty Act sort of being a last ditch sort of effort, but I think it's entirely possible for sure.
The high temperatures this week and the need for power from British Columbia have put a real strain on our province's power grid. Tyler, Premier Smith has even used it as an opportunity to call for more natural gas.
Yeah, so there's this whole debate obviously happening around renewable energy and what the electricity grid is going to look like in the future. And there was an alert earlier this week that said, I think it was between 5 and 7 p.m. or 7 and 9 p.m. to try and conserve power because the grid was under quite a bit of strain. And so Smith has basically said, look, the best way to get this stability in the grid is to ensure that we have more natural gas power. So, it's a regular occurrence in some parts of the country to have the power grid be in a bit of trouble. But in this current moment of discussing what the energy grid is going to look like in the future, it's notable, I think, that Danielle Smith has pointed out that natural gas power is one of the ways to bolster the capacity of the grid.
Let's talk a bit about the green energy moratorium. It's been a little controversial, Tyler, to the extent that the province has even put out a multi-page defense of its decision to pause approvals of the projects, including more wind farms.
Yeah, so they've been a little bit on the back foot. I think it's fair to say they've certainly had their defenders, but it is one of those decisions that I think has left a lot of people scratching their heads. The justification for it was that they needed to look at some of the remediation processes at the end of life of these facilities, what sort of agricultural land was being used for solar farms or wind farms, and what the effects of that could be, the effects on the landscape and the views that Albertans enjoy. And one of the interesting things that's happened this week is that you've had a couple sort of small-ish towns come out and say, look, we banked on a whole bunch of tax revenue from these new projects, namely Caroline and Innisfail are the two that spoke out this week. So it reminds me a little bit of the coal moratorium stuff that we talked about a year or two ago, where the UCP sort of made this decision, and then some of the people who are mad about it weren't your sort of typical downtown NDP voters. Like Caroline that's UCP country down there, and so they've put themselves in this interesting spot where they're taking criticism from sort of all sides a little bit here. And they don't seem to be backing down yet. Maybe that'll change, but certainly a bit of an odd situation. Big industry, lots of jobs. You have some small town folks who are not happy with it. You have other small town folks who are happy with it. So it's a really complicated policy area, it seems to me.
More from Hal's interview with Tyler Dawson after this short break. Don't go away. Welcome back. Ottawa is keeping an eye on policies in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick that would require parental consent before students under the age of 16 can have schools use their preferred pronouns. Could Alberta see similar policies soon? Legislative reporter and Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, says Premier Smith's personal views may not align with Conservative politics.
Tyler, a big issue in both Saskatchewan and New Brunswick is parental rights in schools with regards to students. Now, it's in reference to kids wanting to change their gender identity and or pronouns at school. Now, you say that really hasn't touched Alberta yet?
It doesn't seem to have. So in the last few days, we've had Saskatchewan talking about that. We've had Ontario is now sort of kicking this football around a little bit. And the UCP doesn't seem to have gone down this road yet. That doesn't mean they won't. They do have a convention coming up in early November. And of course, the grassroots constituency associations write all these policy ideas that come up for debate. But Danielle Smith herself, sort of personally, has been sort of reluctant to touch this issue. If you go back to her days as the Wild Rose leader back in 2014, when there was quite a messy debate happening in Alberta politics about gay-straight alliances in schools, Danielle Smith was sort of saying a lot of the things that we're hearing progressive politicians saying right now. She was saying that, look, not all these kids have safe homes. They need to be able to be themselves in school, those kinds of things. The things that, for example, former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, has been saying. So her personal politics, at least in the past, have been a little bit different maybe than some of the stuff we're seeing from other Conservative politicians in the country.
A recent court ruling has undone a number of high-profile COVID-19 era prosecutions, Tyler. As of last week, there are only around, 14 left before the courts, and that number has dwindled since that time. Now, the change has a lot to do with the Ingram case, which has said that the public health rules were done improperly. Can you explain?
Yeah, also a bit of a complicated one. The gist of it is that a lower court judge, a Court of King's Bench judge, said that the Public Health Act that governs Alberta says that final health decisions in a situation like the COVID-19 pandemic needed to be made by the chief medical officer of health. So in this case, it was Dr. Dina Hinshaw. But the way it happened was that cabinet made a lot of these decisions. Elected politicians, not bureaucrats, made these decisions. But the court said, well, actually, the way the legislation is written says that it should have been Hinshaw. And so since it wasn't, the argument was that basically those laws, those rules never could have and never should have existed in the first place. But basically what that means is that these laws shouldn't have existed. Therefore, any sort of prosecutions that happened under them were happening under a mistake, basically. So what seems to be happening now is Crown prosecutors are going before judges in these cases and asking for acquittals or for charges to be dropped. That happened earlier this week in the case of Christopher Scott, who's the owner of the Whistle Stop Cafe in Mirror, Alberta. Ty Northcott, the No More Lockdowns rodeo guy, I believe is in court later this week. There's the possibility of a similar thing happening there. Ditto for James Coates, the pastor of Grace Life Church just outside of Edmonton. So, those are sort of the three biggest health rule prosecutions that I can think of. And those do seem to be on the verge of coming to an end because this ruling said, look, these rules never should have existed in the first place. It's probably worth noting that this I don't think will apply to the four folks from the Coutts border protests because they're facing federal criminal charges, I think, by and large, rather than Public Health Act charges.
It has been over 550 days that the four men who were charged during the Coutts border blockade during the COVID-19 pandemic are still in jail. 3 of them face a charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Do Albertans have a valid reason to be upset these men have been detained for so long? Toronto criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind weighs in.
Well, I don't really know why they're upset that they're behind bars, because these would be the very same people who would complain that if police officers were shot, perhaps by a minority shooter or somebody that looked differently than these 4 men, that shooter of police should be behind bars and shouldn't be out on bail. And the second part is, I was outraged that Tamara Leach, a very well-known name, had to suffer behind bars, and she should never have had to fight so hard for her bail. But these are not Tamara Leach-like offenses. These are men with an arsenal that if other people had them, perhaps from the Mideast or overseas, had this kind of arsenal, these very same people would be saying they belong behind bars, and until they have a trial where the Crown hasn't proven their guilt or their innocence is demonstrated.
Homeschooling is appearing to become more popular in Alberta. That is according to Louis Sain, who is a homeschool facilitator with Wisdom Homeschooling. He says more and more parents are keeping their kids at home to try and instill their own family values. His interview with BCN's Angela Stewart is up next.